Tiny, what's the importance of bookwork and budgeting in the business?
All right, so bookwork and budgeting go hand in hand. A lot of people, unfortunately, in business leave bookwork to later, leave budgeting to later. But what happens there is you have no understanding of what your business is really doing. You know, you could have a lot of money in the bank, but at the end of the 3 months or the 6 months, depending on how you're doing it, your taxes, your GST. So let's use a very simple example. House painting company gives a quote for $22,000 to paint somebody's house, inside and out. Now, in that $22,000, it does seem like a lot of money. Let's take, for instance, the $2,000 for starters goes to GST. So that's something that you collect for the government. Next is you might have staff costs of $10,000. Then you might have material costs of $2,000 or $3,000. After that, you have to incorporate, the cost of running the business, which could be, your motor vehicle, your marketing, all the other bits and pieces. Now, unfortunately, is that a lot of that money doesn't come straight out of your bank account. Now, let's say you've got permanent staff and that comprises of $10,000. You might only actually give them $6,000 of that 10. $3,000 might be for their taxes and $1,000 will be for their super. So that $4,000, it might be paid in 3 or 4 months' time. Next, you have material costs, which you might have a 30-day account. It might be at the beginning of that month, and then at the end of the month, you've got 30 days to pay. So you're not actually paying anything for almost 60 days. Next, you've got marketing costs. So your marketing firm or whatever it may be might be billing you at the end of the month. Then let's say you've got simple things like phone bills and bits and pieces. Something like petrol, well, that'll automatically come out of your account. You'll see that coming out. So in that $22,000, you might actually only be paying $9,000 now and $13,000 over the next, 3 or 4 months. Now, let's say you do one of those jobs a week. By the end of the 3 months, you might have $200,000-300,000 sitting there. Now, you might think, oh, great, I'm rich. I can pay myself and I can, go on that extra holiday or do whatever I want. You have to break that down to what you owe. Now, here's the next part of it. If you're pretty good at budgeting and you know that, and let's call the figure $250,000 that you've got in your bank account, you might be pretty good and you allocate that $200,000 and don't touch it. Well, the $50,000 that you've made profit, you now have to give the tax department a very big chunk of that as well. So when you actually look at a $22,000 job and break it down, yours proportion might only be $2,000, except you've got, $10, $11, $12, $13,000 sitting in the bank account, but really it's only $2,000 is yours, but you get taxed on that, as I said before, so it could only be $1,200 of that. So this is where people basically say, I'll catch up next month and I'll pay that bill and the tax and the end of the year. So I always do my taxes about 3 or 4 days after the financial year and clear the whole debt out. And normally, if you budget correctly and you know what your wage is going to be for the year or what your estimated wages is, and you've already paid, you're pretty right. The majority of businesses, because of bookwork and budgeting, end up not necessarily failing, but they've spent the money on their own lifestyle or whatever bills they have because there's a tremendous amount of money sitting in a bank account. And they go, oh no, we're pretty safe, we've got $200,000 sitting there. Well, $195,000 might be allocated. So that's where the danger part comes in, is that you need to be budgeting and every single job has to be broken down. And if it costs you, hypothetically, like we talked, $50 a lead, and it's taken you 4 leads to get that job, well, that's $200 out of that $22,000 you have to put aside for marketing. So it's not very tricky. It's not very tricky at all, and it doesn't take a lot of time to get an Excel spreadsheet, put your $22,000 in, and basically write what has to come out of that $22,000. And when your bank account says $143,000, you might owe $143,000, and that way you know not to touch it because it's not your money. The last thing is that a lot of companies, a lot of businesses leave their taxes for 9 or 10 months before they do them for the previous year. And when they receive a very large tax bill, they don't have the funds to make it. If they take on more jobs to cover that, the job that you're taking on has its own tax again. So then it becomes extremely complicated, because you might do a $22,000 job or fit some in. You get nothing of that, because you have to pay part of it for last year's and part of it for this year's, because you made extra income. So my advice is break down every single job. It doesn't matter whether it's $1,000 job and it costs you $300 for labour and $50 for material. Break it all down and put it into your different little sections. It's like having 20 envelopes if somebody was paying you cash all the time, and just putting the money in all the different envelopes and not touching them, and not thinking that next month's going to be better, or I'll catch up, or, you know, oh no, she'll be right. Because, you know, after 2 or 3 years in the business, that's why part of the reason 90% of the businesses fail is because they're not doing their budgeting correctly. I know a friend of mine once said the only 2 people on the planet that talk about budgets is you, Tiny, and the Treasurer of Australia. So that's how pretty anal I am with budgeting.
Well, the thing about budgeting and doing bookwork is actually the reason people don't like to do that is because it's boring. It's
boring. It's like, I'll do it tomorrow, I can catch up.
But how to pass that barrier of being
you have to know that unless you're an enormous firm where you've got your own accountant and your own accounts department, I mean, at some point you've got to get to that point. Well, great, if you've got to that point, then you've understood the budgeting and everything like that. But it's something that you have to discipline yourself in. It's as important as quoting. It's as important as, you know, finding the right people. But at the end of the day, that is one of the main killers of business, is because they've overspent, because they've said, well, I work 70, 80 hours a week. I deserve this. I got these big jobs happening, blah, blah, blah. They forget about the lulls. And when you do your bookwork on a consistent basis, let's say twice a week, you know what all the costs are for that job. You know, trying to remember what the costs were for a job, you know, 6 months ago, you got no chance.